Hello and welcome to Citizens Forum. This is being filmed on Tuesday, July the 28th in the Memorial Arena in Victoria, BC. I'd like to start by thanking the volunteer crew and the Shaw staff that makes this program happen every week. The first part of Citizens Forum is usually the Walter and Jack Show, but Walt's out of town, so this week it's the Medhi and Jack Show, and our guest is Medhi Najari. And Medhi, we're going to start off talking about sewage treatment here in Victoria. And when you were on a week or so ago talking about it, you ended by saying there's a lot of money up for grabs. And
yes, and you know, there is about the cost, they say, is going to be around $780 million. But that cost is not going to remain the same. It's going to go up. We saw with other projects that it's going to go up. And the issue is that if we spend that amount of money, and the provincial and federal government is going to pay 1/3 of that 780 million, but anything over or cost overrun, we the people of Greater Victoria have to pay. And if we get this project in, then we are going to not be able to pay for many other needs that the region will have in future. And we should remember what's happened to Detroit. Detroit is bankrupt because in last 15 years they spent lots of money that they shouldn't have, and they created huge debt of $16 billion for Detroit, and now they are bankrupt and they are selling everything they have, their roads, their bridges, their water system, and so on and so forth. If we are going to learn from what's happened to Detroit, we better be careful. There are other proposals that they are talking about $250 million for a distributed system. So I don't understand why CRD is not listening. At least listen to their proposal and see if it makes sense.
Somebody was on CFAX a couple of days ago, and they said that the total cost of the CRD's plan is actually $2.3 billion if you factor in operating costs over the next, I think it's 50 years. And that'll go up too, but let's start with $2.3 billion. And this fellow was promoting, I think, a tertiary distributed system. And he said the total cost of that, best case scenario, could be zero, because not only is it much less expensive to initially put in, but you actually get paybacks over the life of the project. At least this has got to be seriously looked at, but especially the staff at the CRD keep pushing their plan.
Yeah, he was talking about the efficient cost recovery, material recovery. And if that happened, that may pay for itself, for the operation cost. So the operation cost will be zero. And the initial cost of building the distributed system with tertiary treatment of $250 million. So it's important for the CRD to look at this carefully, and the politician consider. The problem has been that about 10 members of the CRD in last 10 years, out of 14 members, almost every time voted for this secondary treatment centralized system, and they refuse to look at the alternative. So again, the question is, we need them to look at the alternatives. There is no reason Jeff Young or Judy Bronoff oppose looking at cheaper alternative. And also it is important to bring public along, you know, in every step of this decision making. I think I as a member of public, I'm very grateful to Focus magazine in last few years. They really had a wonderful article on this issue of sewage, and also Blue Bridge, and also what's happening in Saanich Council or Victoria Council. They really are educating us, you know, they're putting the facts on the table for everybody to see. So if anybody want a quick education on what has been happening in last few years in sewage treatment, they can go to Focus magazine and look at David Broadland articles.
Yeah. So, and it's up to all of us to really keep our eye on this issue. It's a huge issue for the future of the city. We've got to make sure that we get the best system at a good cost, and that the people running the city do not foist a disaster upon us, which is quite possibly what they are going to do. A big news story in Victoria over the last couple of days has been a plan to possibly put a tent city into Topaz Park. And I think it would be for like 100 units, something like that. Is that what they're talking about? Or should we maybe not even use a number? And, you know, of course there's opposition to it from the people who live around there. But the fact is that homeless people are already living in so many or all of our parks, especially in Victoria, but in the outlying cities as well. And I just want to say how ridiculous it is that we in Victoria and cities right across Canada are in this situation now of having to talk about homeless people sleeping in our parks, because this has been deliberately created for us by the corporations who run this country and their politicians and their media. Over the last 20 or 30 years, they have, the corporations who call the shots, their politicians and their media have deliberately created homelessness. And now here we are in cities right across the country having to say, well, should we have a homeless tent city in this park or homeless people sleeping in all these parks? What a crazy situation for us to be in. It's a national, not only a disgrace, it's corrupt, and we've got to fix it up.
I actually like what Lisa Helps is doing in this regard to
Yes.
bringing right now, we are going to have a federal election within 2 months, 2-3 months, and it's important to bring the public attention to the issue.
And just mention what she wants to do.
And she's talking about, you know, the fact that Topaz Park is being considered, which I don't think is a good idea, but focusing public attention to the problem of homelessness and the fact that federal government stopped spending money in public housing. You know, during late 1980s and 1990s, they cut a lots of taxes, corporate taxes, and reduced the ability of government to spend on social expenditure. So the result of those corporate tax cuts is what we see now today, lots of homelessness and child poverty and poverty in general. So it is important during the election bring back the attention of the public to the issue of homelessness. And I think Lisa Helps is doing a wonderful job. And she's talking about asking all the other mayors to come to Ottawa one day in October and sleep over by the Parliament Hill in order to highlight the problems.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful.
So once again, Lisa Helps has suggested that all the mayors in Canada fly to Ottawa one day in October and camp, have a tent city on Parliament Hill. And I think it's a good idea. And the focus has got to be, I mean, from my perspective, the focus has got to be that this is deliberate. This has not happened by accident. The social safety net has been deliberately cut by the politicians, and with the complete assistance of the corporate media, who keep telling us the official line that the way to prosperity is free trade deals, tax cuts for big business, spending cuts on the poor because we can't afford that, and we've ended up where we are.
If you remember, after Chrétien come to power, there was a huge campaign of we cannot afford our social expenditure because of $600 billion debt.
Yes.
So
that's going back to
1993, 1994.
That's right.
So then they said, nobody asked how this debt, this $600 billion was created. The fact was the debt was created because 50% of it was because of the interest rate manipulation by financial institutions. They raised the the level of interest rate, and that pile up the debt.
Yes.
And another 40% of it was because of the tax cut to the big corporations, and only 8% of the $600 billion was caused by the social expenditure.
Yes.
But
and you know, I started to write a book on that many years ago, which got changed into something else. But I was absolutely shocked by what I found, because it's exactly as Medhi has just said. But this was never told to us. But it was corporate tax cuts and then a huge hike in interest rates that created the national debt. The national debt back then was about $500 billion. We've spent $1 trillion paying interest on that. $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion. And the national debt is now at $600 billion. And that's how they have strangled our society and transformed our country. The politicians, the media, and the corporations that tell them both what to do.
so when they said what to do about it, the Kretschmann government came out, and from the start of 1994 to 2000, they cut drastically social expenditure in order to get rid of the deficit and reduce the debt. And that was when the housing market, building public housing, was reduced, and the poverty increased and the homelessness increased.
So this deliberately created national debt, the truth always kept hidden from the Canadian people, was then used amongst many other things, to make the federal government get out of building social housing, which they used to do. And it left our housing sector completely in the hands of the private sector, and the private sector has completely failed us. They haven't, obviously there's a shortage of housing, or there would be homes at the bottom end of the scale for the homeless, and the homes that the rest of us have to buy and rent would be a lot cheaper. They didn't want that, and they created this disaster.
And we saw when the government stopped cutting more taxes of the big business, then that was the time that big business decided in 2005 to get rid of Paul Martin government.
Exactly. So let's tell that story, because it was 2005. This is the story of how, especially the media, but the corporations that own them, who tell them what to print and show, how they got rid of Paul Martin and brought in, for the next 10 years, Stephen Harper. And it all started with Paul Martin going to increase corporate taxes.
No, actually it started with the budget in February of 2005 with the federal budget. In that budget, Paul Martin and Ralph Goodell brought about $4.6 billion further tax cut for the corporations. Okay. It was a minority government, if you remember. Harper liked that budget, but he said because they were official opposition, they are going to vote against it.
Okay.
So it came to either Jill Lusep or Mr. Layton. Mr. Layton came and said, we are not going to accept the $4.6 billion further tax cut.
This was the NDP, said we won't accept a $4.6 billion corporate tax cut.
And suggested to Martin government that if you take that $4.6 billion and spend it on housing, post-secondary education, and transportation, we will support your budget.
Okay, so get rid of the corporate tax cut and spend it on social programs instead. Okay.
And the Martin accepted that, but that was not acceptable to the establishment, to the big business. They start a huge campaign against Martin, where they were saying, for example, you read.
Business lobbyists warn Martin against dropping tax cuts. So again, the Liberals had proposed a $5 billion corporate tax cut. The NDP said no, and Martin went along with it. And they got rid of the corporate tax cut, and they were going to spend that money, instead of giving it to the corporations, spend it on social programs. Business lobbyists warned Martin against dropping tax cuts.
And many others. And Harper called it the deal with the devil. And the devil's supposed to be Layton. And then later they worked with the devil themselves. And the Canadian Council of Chief Executive warned Martin that not to do that. But because Martin didn't have any other choice here, he went along. And then in late fall, the fall of 2005, suddenly Mr. Layton switched his alliance, went and made a deal with Mr. Harper and Gilles Lesseps, and they vote non-confidence and brought the government down and caused the election.
Okay, so once again, there was going to be a $5 billion tax cut, but Mr. Martin, Prime Minister Martin at the time, changed that and said, okay, we're not going to give corporations the tax cut, we're going to spend the money on social programs. And then a short time after that, the NDP brought the Martin government down. And
then when we had the election, we saw everything. Here is the natural party of ruling party of Canada. Suddenly, the Liberals didn't know how to run an election campaign.
That was when the media brought in the, what was it called, the
they were saying
that
the opposition,
ad scam,
Gomery inquiry and ad scam, and we were talking about $20 to $30 million at most.
Yeah, and the media using that advertising scandal, which wasn't a scandal, there was nothing there, and Martin wasn't really involved, but they turned it into such a thing, the media just did it, that Martin, who had been quite popular,
they
the party
portrayed
collapsed.
Martin and Liberals as a very corrupt.
And Mr. Harper was brought in.
And what's happened during that election, we see suddenly for the first time in the history of RCMP, 2 times they announced in the press conference that they are investigating Ralph Goodell for
who was at that time the Liberal
finance minister.
So during the campaign, the RCMP, for the first time in their history, announces they're investigating the finance minister for something he did.
They claim that there was the income trust announcement was leaked.
Right.
The government and some private party benefited from that, but there was no truth to that.
And there was no truth to the scandal. But those two things got rid of Paul Martin and brought in Stephen Harper. That's the power of a corporate media, to essentially get rid of any politician they don't like and bring in a government they want. And that power exists to this very day and is probably even stronger now than it was then. And if we can't overcome that, then, I mean, we're already in huge trouble.
During that campaign, there was also the NDP only attacked Martin. They didn't talk about the danger of Harper. In fact, I remember very vividly Friday, January 13, 2006, about a week before the election day, there was a press conference in Toronto with Council of Canadian, Elizabeth May representing environmentalists, social justice and economic justice activists, begging Mr. Layton to talk about the danger of Harper, and Layton refused. He was only attacking.
So I think what you're saying is that Mr. Layton worked to bring in, I mean, that was the result. The NDP brought in Stephen Harper.
Yes, the NDP helped to bring Harper to a minority government, and later in 2008 and 2011, the majority government. And if we are going to understand, if we learn from those experiences, then we can act much better in this coming election.
Well, this coming election, does it matter?
It is very, very important. If we get another Harper government, they already gutted Canada. You know, they are gutting the social fabric of the country. They destroyed, for example, they destroyed the libraries in Ministry of Health and Ministry of Environment. All the past record of Canadians, are gone almost. All the data on lake, for example, the condition of the lakes and the rivers and so on and so forth. Lots of those information are gone. we see they got rid of many scientists. So this gang that are in power, they are gutting Canada. They created the House of Cards. They gutted Canada from inside, and it's going to collapse.
I agree with you, but I honestly don't think that if we elect a Tom Mulcair NDP government or a Liberal government, it's going to be any different. Am I wrong?
No, it's important I think it's very important for the province of Ontario. People don't vote NDP because then that reduced the Harper majority or even Harper minority government.
But vote Liberal?
Vote Liberals or Greens at most. And I think in British Columbia, we should elect more Greens. And I'm saying that after being 23 years member of NDP, and right now I don't have a member of any party. So
We're
it's not a...
Medhi, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Upcoming election. Thank you for watching this segment of Citizens Forum.